So I guess from my side, I've not caught all of the content on your channel. I know you've got a channel, Digital Gnosis. I've caught your conversation with Paul Vanderklay, and I think you did a video around your conversion to Christianity, and I think you might have not like gone to Christianity and come back, is my general sense. But look, I just thought it would be a cool conversation to have with you, just to talk, because I was really interested to hear you're doing the masters in philosophy, and that must be all starting and kicking off for you right now. But like, yeah, myself, I've just moved to Bristol. Just started a PhD at the Uni of Bristol, and it's in religion and theology. And like, yeah, I would say like the philosophy of religion kind of thing. And so
is that sort of with the idea of going into like the ministry, or with the idea of doing it like as an academic pursuit?
Yeah, as an academic pursuit, I think at the moment, because it's called religion and theology. But I did a master's in philosophy at Essex, and I did a BA in politics and philosophy at Essex, and so I have a background in philosophy, and so I'm not like studying theology in the sense of like studying like the doctrine of the Trinity or something like this, but I'm studying the philosophy of religion. So I'm looking at conceptions like the sacred, the holy, atheism, agnosticism, like what all these worldviews mean, and the different religious concepts associated. So I just thought we'd have a cool chat now as well.
Yeah, I think it's all, I mean, that's all stuff I'm very interested in as well. Yeah, like I suppose I'm primarily interested in philosophy of religion, right? I mean, I find all the various topics really in philosophy, except maybe endless conceptual analysis of knowledge and epistemology. Like I find that bores me to death, but pretty much everything else I find very interesting in philosophy, and particularly, philosophy of religion is definitely the thing that I guess it's the thing that got it all really started for me in terms of as an adult properly looking into it, and it's the thing that is the reason why I really care about these other topics as well. I mean, I think they're valuable in and of themselves, but I'm like, well, what are the implications of this now for the thing I really care about, which is like, the big religious questions.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally they said that theology was the queen of the sciences, and that philosophy was like the handmaiden to theology. So it's really interesting, and especially when you like look at some of the ancient Greeks. I'm reading a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom by Peter Kingsley, who's talking about like the religious culture. Someone like Parmenides, the pre-Socratic, who gives us like ontology, like or the Pythagoreans, like there are very deep religious impulses at work, I think, in the birth pangs of Greek philosophy. And yeah, no, there's certainly a relationship between an ideal like truth, big T, as something bit to be pursued, and that's a very traditional conception of the Godhead and stuff like this. But I guess where's your head at the moment intellectually? So you've just started this. Is it a master's at Glasgow? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm doing a master's. It's a conversion course in philosophy. So basically, one of the modules that you have to take is just this intro to analytic philosophy course, and then the rest of it you can just select, the typical kind of course selection really. So yeah, I'm doing philosophy of language and logic in this first semester, auditing unity of science, and then next semester philosophy of religion, Wittgenstein, and then I think I'll audit metaphysics and philosophy of maths, because they just won't let you take, like, obviously you can't take more like courses than are available. But I'm kind of worried that if I finish the masters, like I don't know how confident I am that I'll be able to either financially support myself through like a PhD or whatever afterwards. So I'm like, I've got to like get all the learning I can while I've kind of given myself this year to to kind of pursue this stuff.
And will it culminate in a thesis? Because I did a taught masters at Essex where it was half taught modules and then a thesis in the summer.
Yeah, I forget how many. So would be due in August, and I think the idea is that it's sort of like around spring next year that you properly sort of have an idea of what you're writing it on, and who your supervisor is going to be for that. And yeah, so I think teaching kind of focusing on that. If there's any.
Oh, I think the connection's gone, Nathan.
Um,
It might just be my side.
if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can. The image, the video is frozen though. Are you still there?
Have you got? Yeah, I'm back. I just turned my video off for a second to see if that helped with.
Cool. Okay, cool. Cool.
There we go. Though.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it should be. Yeah. So I've been thinking. I've been kind of running a few ideas around about what I would like to do. So either sort of like what kind of considerations should cause someone to like change something foundational about their belief system, I think is a very interesting question, because I think for a lot of these big questions in philosophy of religion in particular, I can see how there's sort of just different lenses that you could apply, or different kind of webs of beliefs, which would make you just interpret the facts or the relevant considerations differently if you looked at it that way. And for me, because I can see several of those kind of belief webs as like rational things that one could adopt, and I can't see a clear kind of standard for deciding between them, it makes it quite difficult for me to really be like committal to any of these systems, whether it'd be like a reductive naturalism or a kind of like religious commitment. Any of those positions I find very difficult to firmly sort of like identify with. And so I think it could be interesting to look into what should the considerations be that would cause you to kind of confidently adopt one or the other. And then another thing I'm interested in doing would be like stage 2 of most natural theology arguments. The most natural theology arguments in stage 1 are going to establish like some kind of necessary being or something like that, and then the second stage is going to be trying to identify that with the particular god of some theology. And then I think it would be interesting to do a kind of model comparison between basically how would a naturalist look at this, how would like an analytic Thomist or something look at this, and see if there's a sort of consistent set of theoretical virtues that would be adopted by each person, that would then where you could then kind of put your flag in the sand, as it were, and say, well, yeah, this model is actually the superior one, because if you adopt a theistic model, then you can account for like axiological values or something, which can't be done if you just say, well, the universe is just like this necessary natural thing. So I mean, I'm not saying that that's where I am, but that plausibly that kind of thing could be sketched out, and it'd be good to almost have a flow chart where you could always go down it and say like yes, no to each thing, and see where it kind of lands you as well.
Would you describe yourself as an agnostic?
Yeah, it's definitely epistemically, I'd say I'm an epistemic agnostic.
Yeah, so you're interested in a kind of framework of evaluation for different plausible worldviews, ranging from theism to atheism, and a way of weighing those up or judging their plausibility. That's how I'm understanding what you said?
Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, so I guess one part of it would be that when it comes to theory comparison, so you sort of build up this theory, and then there's a set of values by which you judge what makes a good theory. But even those values themselves aren't like stance independent. They're not. Those are things that are going to be informed rather by your commitments that you already have, which are going to be linked into those commitments that you're trying to establish in the argument as well. So I find the whole project really kind of difficult, because on the one hand, someone like Graham Oppy, for example, when it comes to most of these arguments from natural theology, he basically accepts the argument in a way that a lot of maybe popularizers of atheism, or maybe just people aren't used to seeing that. Someone who would be willing to basically accept the Kalam cosmological argument or a contingency argument, but then just goes, well, yeah, the first point in the earlier than direction is just like necessary or something, or it's like, so yeah, I'm with you on the argument. It's just this kind of this end bit of identifying it with the god of some particular the god of some particular theology, rather than like just some metaphysical entity or whatever.
Well, I think Nietzsche might be kind of interested in this conversation, because I think part of what was so radical about his philosophy was his effort to kind of bring philosophy back to the body, and like the passions, and like, so he, my sense of Nietzsche was that he was very critical of like kind of disinterested philosophy, is what he called it, and his thought that was like that each philosopher brings with them almost like carnal instincts, like, and he was kind of prefiguring Freud, I think, in many respects, like where he's saying that we bring a kind of existential passion and weight and how can I say it, like flesh and blood to our philosophy, and that this is how philosophers fundamentally are. And like this is what I really take from Nietzsche. And like, so he's putting, how can I say it? From what I'm hearing you say, he's kind of pointing out that the Catholic or the atheist or whosoever has a interested, embodied commitment, life, passion, bias, we could say maybe, that's there first and foremost, and that the project of disinterested philosophy is necessarily deeply nested inside of that, do I want to say faith commitment or kind of existential commitment? And I just thought I'd mention that because it seems kind of relevant to your project to some degree.
I guess I need a bit of help sort of maybe fleshing that out or understanding, what's being said, because like I'm not an expert on Nietzsche or anything, and I can kind of see how it's relevant, but I want to make sure I've got the right idea. So is it, there's two ways that I'm thinking that could be, that what's being said there could be relevant. One of which might be that like it's I don't know, it's a necessary condition or something for engaging in philosophy, that you've already made a kind of existential commitment on a question like whether God exists or not.
So, okay, so maybe the way I could put it to you is, who is it? Thomas Nagel has written this book called, which I have not read, unfortunately. What's it called?
The View from Nowhere?
That's it. The View from Nowhere. Okay. And so what I'm trying to convey to you about Nietzsche is that he's kind of like the opposite of that. He's saying like, no,
right,
beauty is not like this disinterested thing. It is like my passionate desire as someone who's inherited instinct and desire and passion and idiosyncrasy, and so it's interested. There is no view from nowhere. There is the I that wants. There is my existential concern, and this we must never forget. And philosophers have got outside of themselves in forgetting that and supposing that they are in this disinterested view from nowhere. And that's my take on Nietzsche anyway. And I think there were a few, like Kierkegaard, and a few people in the 19th century who were kind of waking up to this, do I want to say like Enlightenment rationalism, or this project of trying to assume the view from nowhere, whilst being existentially alive, or like vital in some sense. And yeah, I guess the reason I mentioned that is because I think that's important context in these kind of conversations, because there is a way in which it boils down, from my perspective at least, it boils down to our lives and the relevance philosophy has to our lives, and what these concepts mean, and how an idea of God or not God might influence my ethics, my aesthetics, how I treat people, these kind of things. There's a whole passionate kind of view from somewhere frame that I think Nietzsche wants to emphasize and remind us of.
I guess
hopefully that connects anyway.
Well, that it makes sense as a position that's being put forward, but I think for me, my understanding of it as it stands, at least, it still falls into that problem that I'm having between sort of deciphering between the options that are available. So, I mean, I'd say in terms of that, like Hegelian stance or whatever you might want to call it, you know, that we're trying to get an objective view from nowhere or something. I mean, I do think that that is like a value sort of laden assumption or something. And I, you know, the Nietzschean point of view that, well, we shouldn't do that because that doesn't exist or something. I also kind of think that that's a value laden assumption though as well. And my issue is that I'm sort of trying to say, well, I can see how someone could rationally sort of adopt either set of values and sort of gestalts or ways of viewing you know, reality, but what can I what can I appeal to sort of decide between them myself, you know? Yeah, I think
Well,
yeah.
this is where I think, like, so you said you're doing some modules on analytic philosophy, like logic, etc. So some of the stuff I did at Essex, they were very focused on like the continental tradition of philosophy, and so you have figures like Nietzsche, but another one I want to mention here is Kierkegaard, who how can I say it? I think he's really his writings are really beautiful, and I see him really struggling through this kind of question and concern that you're raising, because he's saying, because a lot of his concern is like questions like faith. You know, he wrote a book called Fear and Trembling, where he looked at the story of Abraham and Isaac to try and analyze what kind of faith Abraham must have had for that to happen. But he also talks about the way in which he had fallen into the cup of knowledge, is what he called it. He asked questions like, what value would objective truth be to me, unless I could make it a truth that is my own? He famously said, like, subjectivity is truth, is like one of to paraphrase something that Kierkegaard said. And so he found that he'd fallen into the cup of wisdom, like fallen into the different theories around philosophy and the different positions of what might be had. But this is from his early journal entries. He's like, what does all of that mean if it does not relate to a truth that I am willing to live and die for? Basically, if it doesn't boil down to a kind of existential commitment, a kind of faith, and Kierkegaard famously coined the leap of faith, like the idea of being existentially committed, and kind of how important that move is. Do I want to say prior to knowledge? I don't. I'm curious about the relationship between objective knowledge and his kind of this sense of subjectivity as truth. I'm not trying, because I think objective knowledge is really important, and so. But I think intuitively, I'm just feeling that Kierkegaard is getting at similar concerns there, because he is very much concerned with, like, you kind of like how we act in relationship to worldviews and what our kind of level of existential commitment is to them, that leap of faith kind of into them. And that's why in Fear and Trembling, he's looking at Abraham as, it's classically understood as a pretty horrific story. Like a lot of the new atheists use that as a kind of, well, it's a pretty crazy story, to be fair, from the Old Testament. And yeah, no, but he does an analysis of it, right? And he's looking at Abraham as an agent. I think he uses the term the knight of faith, the Kierkegaard's knight of faith, which is kind of similar to Nietzsche's Übermensch. But this idea of, like, yeah, being existentially committed to a worldview and how that happens. And I think he's kind of saying something like a leap, and because, like, what he's saying is, like, it's not a question of quantitative analysis. Okay, so what I hear you saying is, like, you've got atheism feels plausible, theism feels plausible, Nietzsche feels plausible. There's all these different, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just trying to understand what you said. You're saying there's a lot of different worldviews that have different assumptions, and that have a kind of internal coherence to them and that look relatively plausible, like relatively equally plausible to you as a choice of kind of how to live. And there's all this kind of, all these options. And so like Kierkegaard's thing is kind of like around like quantity and quality, the idea of like, how does that rational infinity collapse into a leap of faith? Okay, and that's a very mysterious question, because that thing of evaluating worldviews, it kind of doesn't have it's kind of infinite in the sense it's like there's no bounds to the degree that rationality can evaluate the benefits and the drawbacks of different systems of worldview. And so it's this tension in Kierkegaard between reason or rationality, which analyzes to the quantitative in a kind of flat way, and then what is it that makes me choose this and that. And so he's actually got this book that I'm reading. It's called Either or, a fragment of life. Read that one. Yeah, but the title is kind of telling that either or, you know, like this existential decision, like I'm either a theist, I'm either an atheist, like I either marry or I don't marry. And he puts a lot of emphasis on the existential weight of those kind of decisions. And I think paints the picture of them in terms of the soul. I don't know if he really uses that language, but I think that might be the best conceptual resource to understand kind of what he's getting at. He's talking about this idea of inwardness as the thing that finally makes the decision in the face of rational quantity, you know. And he was living through the dawning of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century in Denmark. But so I've rambled a bit there, but I'm just trying to connect some of the things.
Yeah, I think I mean, I suppose there's a weaker sense of interpreting what you're saying there that I think I'm mostly on board with, which would be maybe closer to like the Humean like reason as a kind of slave of the passions or something. It's not quite what is being said about this existential commitment to leap of faith, but I do think that I think we're less rational about these things, and there is some kind of almost it's like a pre-theoretical like emotional desire or something to see a thing a certain way, and that I mean that's certainly been the case for me in becoming like an evangelical type Christian in the first place. Was that, you know, there was this emotional angst about the way the world is and becoming an adult and stuff that prompted me towards like figuring out if there could be a kind of cosmic narrative that gave meaning and stuff to my life, and then similarly in coming out of that, it was like the bad, I think mostly the bad actions of people who were a part of that belief system that gave me like the emotional impetus to want to see like if I could question that, or if, you know, if there was a different way of looking at things. And I think that emotional aspect is a part of it, but maybe it's something slightly different that Kierkegaard's getting at. Like the I definitely agree with the analogies like between these kind of decisions that everyone faces regardless of worldview, like you know, should I marry this person, or should I should I split up from this relationship or get a divorce? I think that is actually closer to the picture. I mean, it's closer theoretically to the picture being painted by theism, right? Because God is supposedly a being to whom you have a relationship, right? It's not, but I think the kind of way we actually, at least the phenomenology, right, of that experience of the difficultness almost of evaluating that, because it's not like there's an objective answer to it. It's not like there's like I can, even if I got all the scientists in the world to work on whether or not I should like marry this person or something, I mean, they could maybe find some consensus on some things. Like they might be able to say, well, you're likely to earn slightly lower if you marry this person, or but it's like, but there's always going to be this ethical position of, but is that how you ought to, you know, make this decision? And I agree that that's kind of similar to being confronted with something like theism, or something like atheism, right? And making that, or if you are a theist and you're considering like leaving, it's similar. It's similar to the pain of considering a divorce or something. So yeah, I do think those analogies are good, but I think again, I mean, one of the things that I find difficult with Kierkegaard, particularly, is I kind of read into some of his decision making around these like religious commitments, and I think, well, this is obviously being informed by his personal life experiences as well, and I wonder like, so he made this decision about is it Regina Olsen, this person who he was really sort of infatuated with, and then I think he decided not to marry her, and she married someone else and then went somewhere. And it seems like obviously this is like the paradigm sort of physical example that exemplifies how he's thinking about his relationship to the spiritual life as well. And I do wonder if he viewed things differently at the worldview level, then might he have flourished more from making the decision, well, actually, it's not that I need to like do all this philosophy and stuff, but actually if I like marry this person and have like a normal life, that would be, I would flourish more as a person or something. And again, those kind of judgments I think are value laden, and then I'm sort of back to my position of like, well, how do I distinguish between those values? And maybe it's right that it is to some degree like an existential leap to just commit to some set of values, or maybe I just can't choose my values at all and I just have them and I'm kind of trapped. I don't know, but that, whatever those values are, I'm having a tough time finding like a principled reason really to like choose one set over the other. Yeah, I don't know if
No, that's a really fair
if
struggle. That's a really fair struggle, Nathan. I really understand where you're coming from there. I guess there's a tension between this concept of the existential leap, however much credit we give it, and the idea of principled reasons. It's kind of like what finally makes that decision to marry, because marriage is a big theme in Kierkegaard, and as you said, with his actual life, it was a really important thing. And he famously has this line like, if I marry, I will regret it, and if I don't marry, I will regret it also. Which is classic Kierkegaard. But I love that, because I think that I do think that does get at the anxiety of the soul. Like, because another theme in him is anxiety, but this idea of like the precipice in which the human soul is on with such decisions. God, is there a God or is there not a God? Should I marry or should I not? Is there a soul or not? Like these things, I guess an argument I would advance would be that these things are not and cannot finally be objective, or I guess objective would be my word, because what I heard you say earlier, and I don't know if you were agreeing or not, but I think that there's some common ground there, is when you were talking about like the science of like, should I marry, right? You were saying kind of like finally, what I heard you saying is that kind of finally it comes down to, I mean, for me, it would be a judgment of will, a judgment of will, a free will choosing this and not that. And this is where kind of Nietzsche's kind of romanticism comes in. Why should I choose this? Why should I choose that? Why should I aspire the Übermensch, this greatness of human being, or Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith? They're figures that are kind of producing these kind of existential ideals as to how these complex and idiosyncratic and personal and particular decisions are made as a human being. And I'm sure it's not an exhaustive answer. I'm just saying that existentialism has some resources, I think, to help us unpack this mystery of how such things are navigated, because it doesn't, I don't see how I could say objective rationality broadly construed can ever solve that problem, because it can only ever continue its analysis of different possibilities, which is really helpful. Like we have this ability to analyze, evaluate, weigh up, which is super really, I mean, that's really, really an important cognitive faculty for human beings to be able to do that. And I don't want to undermine it. I'm just saying that I don't think that ever finally moves our heart to commitment. I think there's something erotic about that, technically speaking. Like, I read Plato's Symposium recently, and which is basically an ode to Eros, the Greek deity. And in Plato, Eros is an attractive power. Like, there is something about the good or the true or the beautiful which kind of calls us to the veneration of it. And you've got Raphael's Academy behind you, which is something I really admire, that work of art. And but like, even your choice to pursue this master's, and I think it's connected with my PhD, I think there's something about Eros or love or desire or a movement towards the appreciation of a form of goodness, and maybe truth, capital T truth, which kind of undergirds the project of philosophy in some sense, is it calls to our hearts in a way that lies and falsity don't, or something. Like, there's something ontological, riffing here now, but and you can see my Platonic kind of persuasions, I guess, but like, there's something kind of ontologically attractive about capital T truth that calls the soul into the investigation of that, interest into that, care about those topics, passion about those topics, and a spirited investigation of them. And that's, I don't know, I'm not giving a clear and cut answer to your dilemma, but I think it's a very nuanced and important dilemma to explore. I think, like, it is a real tension and a mystery how we finally decide, really, how we do step on a definite path and constrain that possibility of this option, that option, and kind of walk. But
I again, in terms of what you're saying there, I do think it still leads me back to sort of like almost the place that I'm stuck in and not being able to decide between values, because I do share that phenomenology, right? That I am presented with the same aesthetic values, you might say, of like truth, beauty, and goodness as a sort of final cause of my rational being or something. But the problem is that is like a theory, right, that I have and hold to, and that orders my perception itself. And I'm aware that
what makes you think it's wrong? What makes you think there are reasons for not believing that?
I think that there's other theories that can account for the phenomenology, right, but don't like postulate the same ontology. And even though I don't, even though my credence is sort of like towards this one, it's not enough that I would be able to sort of like just discount that and go, yeah, well, that one's just so clearly wrong, because I have.
Could you articulate the other theory for me? Because I guess I'm putting my cards on the table. I've got Platonic leanings on this, and I feel like the hypostases of the truth, the good, the true, and the beautiful, I find that a very plausible account of ontology and epistemology, etc. So what alternative paradigms or worldviews do you have in mind here? I'm curious.
I guess there's a couple of broadly the big ones would be a kind of like Aristotelianism, maybe, or a sort of like naturalized Thomism, or then a kind of reductive naturalism, or I would say would be like those would be like broadly what I'd see as like the three main categories. So you've got like this kind of Platonism, a kind of Aristotelianism, and a kind of nominalism, right? And maybe if I went down like a reductive naturalism, like nominalism route, it would just be to provide an account of that phenomenology, but purely in terms of like brain states and psychology, right? Which does account for the phenomenology. And does it and some story about,
hang on. So you think it accounts for the phenomenology? See, that's we might disagree there, because so unpack that. I don't see how.
For example, like if I find certain things beautiful, right, there's going to be some story to be told about why I am finding them beautiful that doesn't involve appealing to like participation in like an objective form or standard of beauty, but it's just that it sort of, stimulates, I don't know, this is a very simplistic reduction, but it stimulates B fibers in the brain, that's obviously like as ad hoc as it comes, because I'm not basing that off of actually looking into the psychological literature, but it stimulates beauty fibers in the brain, and that explains as well, maybe an argument that might be put forward is, well, this actually then explains why we have like disagreement about aesthetic, like which pieces of art really are more beautiful, better, because we just have these different instantiations of neurology or something. So that would be like an outline of what that alternative.
So my objection to that is that neurology and brain states are not, neurology and brain states and phenomenology are different ways of looking at, they're kind of different styles of approaching a question, I guess. Because when you're talking about neurology, you're talking about neurons, which are particular aspects of my being and your being as human beings, and like get all into the science of it. But neurons are, nerve cells. And so like there's a frame there, and then there's a phenomenological frame. And for me, the phenomenological frame, I guess the word I could use for it would be like an ensouled frame, or maybe an agentic frame, where it's about my heart or my desire in relationship to a telos, an end or a good, such as beauty, and my judgments about beauty and my aspirations to that, or goodness and truth. And so when you use the word phenomenology, I think of that in terms of Sam's experience, and you can think of it as Nathan's experience. And I'm reading Husserl at the moment, his ideas, and trying to get an understanding of what his phenomenological project is. But I don't see that, Nathan. I don't see how maybe Sam Harris, or just the science of neurology and neuroscience, which I find really, really fascinating. It is fascinating. But that kind of naturalism, or maybe nominalism, I don't see how that does speak into phenomenology, because it doesn't. Because if I'm attracted to a good, okay, like I find someone's moral character admirable, or I find a theory embodies some form of truth, or I see an artwork and a painting that's really beautiful, I listen to a really moving piece of music that's beautiful. So for me, this might get a bit complex, but for me, what's happening there is some kind of collapsing of the rational infinity of available choices and possibilities, like all of the pieces of music I could listen to, all of the stories I could engage with, all of the intellectuals I could follow, like however we define it, that all kind of collapses and coheres into a definite value, which I am kind of erotically related to. I'm desiring, I'm engaging with, I'm giving my attention to. And you could say I'm worshipping, but we don't need to go there. But like, there's a kind of veneration for, and respect for, and attention given to what I am perceiving as a good. And for me, I think we need a theory that says, look, what is this good? How does this good exist? Is it in any particular thing? Is Jordan Peterson as an intellectual, is he the embodiment of truth, or is truth actually something he's on a journey towards and aspiring to, and that we all kind of are? Or like the same with a painting, like, is this painting beauty? And so then implicit in what we're discussing here is the medieval problem of universals, the position, are abstractions real? Like, is beauty, goodness, and truth real? Are those things real, or are they not? And the nominalist would deny that reality in some way. And so this is part of my PhD research proposal, and part of the things I'm looking at is how exactly naturalism, what are its metaphysics? What is its ontology? How is it going to say to me? How can I say it? Like, how does it account for beauty? Like, as a value which as a value, as a lived and real value of my experience and your experience, because it does seem to profoundly structure our experience, beauty as an example or truth or whatsoever. And so I think Platonic realism gives us a cogent, robust theory of the ground of these attractive principles, such as goodness or beauty. And I don't see how naturalism does. And so for my research proposal in August, I was looking at some of the meaning in life literature. Someone called Susan Wolfe, wants to argue that meaning in life happens when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness. And that's the argument she wants to advance about meaning in life. And she wants to do that on a naturalistic metaphysics. And so she wants a kind of objectivity to meaning in life. She doesn't want to say that meaning is just the mere fleeing, mere movement of passions. Oh, I'm passionate about this, I'm passionate about that, therefore life's meaningful. She doesn't want to say that, as someone like Harry Frankfurt might argue. She doesn't want to say that. She wants to say, look, there's a more objective basis to our values here. Loving a human being is more important than, and a greater source of meaning than, loving my favorite tub of ice cream or something lower. And so she wants to make that argument, and I'm kind of with Wolf on that. I'm like, yeah, but part of what I'm interrogating or trying to understand, and it's an ongoing project really, is how precisely naturalism does that. Because I don't understand that, and I think there's a real lacuna in the metaphysics and the ontology there to give an account of something like meaning. And especially when you contrast it against Platonic realism, which I think has, well, a profound account of value in it. So yeah, sorry. I guess I'm arguing for Platonic realism contra nominalism, and I think this whole conversation is implicit in what we're discussing. The status of, basically the status of the invisible world, or the status of patterns, the status of abstractions, the status of things like chair, like the concept of a chair versus the particular instantiations of it. So I don't find the naturalism and nominalism plausible, and I don't see how it accounts for my experience phenomenologically. So I'm curious how you might think that's the case, or what your thoughts are on those kind of things.
Well, I suppose I ought to preface saying this with that I do lean towards a kind of Platonism, but I think the disagreement in what you're saying there would be like an epistemic point, perhaps, about the theory ladenness of perception. So maybe if I don't think that there are sort of givens in our perception, right? So sort of these things in our phenomenology where we can just sort of take for granted that they are the way that they're presenting, without because our interpretation of what it is that we're being presented with is informed by the theory that we're adopting at the time, right? Because I think that I sort of am this this web of beliefs, as it were, that's kind of like being, I'm presented with a thing, and the way that appearance, like the way that I come to interpret that appearance, the way that my perception orders that appearance, is according to the belief system that I'm currently adopting. And I don't think I sort of have this, I don't know, direct access to the truth. So I don't, even though it falls out of a kind of Platonism that I might adopt, right? That for like a medium-sized object, like a cup or something, like it falls out of my theory that I'm currently adopting, that I am perceiving, like a cup, like there really is a cup there. It's not just atoms arranged cupwise or something, right? But that being said, I wouldn't. I recognize that it falls out of my theory that I have that belief that that's what's going on with my perception. I wouldn't say that like I wouldn't say that I could appeal to phenomenal, like say if I was talking to, I've got a lot of friends who are nominalists, for example, and I was talking to them, I couldn't just appeal to their the character of their phenomenology to say, but look, it is a cup, right? Because I acknowledge that there's this whole different set of beliefs that are ordering the way that they're perceiving the world. So there aren't like these givens that can be appealed to in that sense, to just sort of say, you know, like there's
Uh,
the thing, right? Yeah,
I
and I
was
think that that's
discussing
maybe the
this last
difference.
night actually. That's really
Yeah,
so.
yeah,
I mean, you just held up the cup, right? And I
yeah,
recognize it as a cup. So like, this is going to be, I guess, that would be my argument against what you said there. Is like, you hold it up as a cup. I know it's a cup, yeah. When you say the word cup, intelligible, like
right.
the intelligible pattern you're pointing to, I like grok as you say it and
Hmm.
as you point to it. Okay, so there's a kind of shared forum of intelligibility which we're implicitly participating in when you just did that. So isn't that the same with your nominalist
Well,
friends? Don't they?
yeah. Well, this is the interesting because this is what's interesting because all of these data points, right, that you're sort of pointing out there, like, well, you know, using the term cup, right, to refer to it, they're not going to disagree on that point. Like, you know, it's not, you can't sort of put forward the argument that well, you wouldn't call it a cup on nominalism because they're like, yeah, of course I'd call it a cup, right? And you know, and they're like, of course I'd use it for drinking, because the disagreement is about the theory that accounts for the distinction between appearance and reality, which is like a metaphysical theory, right? So they'd agree, sort of, they their theory would also provide an account for why our experience has the phenomenal character that it does, right? Just as a sort of Platonist theory, like, you know, maybe there's some differences between our theory, but like our theory would provide an account of why their phenomenology has the character that it does. But it's very difficult to,
Well, the
yeah,
nominalist would say, wouldn't the nominalist say, look, cup is a useful word in English to refer to this thing we drink tea from. It's useful. It's a useful pattern, but like the idea, the eidos in Greek of the cup, isn't real.
yeah,
That's what the nominalist argument is, right? Is like,
right,
it might be a useful nominal means name, doesn't it? So it's like cup
yeah,
is a
yeah, yeah,
useful linguistic concept. Cool, we can both share and use that. But you're talking to me about the cupness of the cup as the eidos of the cup, as
right.
though that's a real thing. I don't follow you there. That's what the nominalist would want to say. Um, but so then I think my real problem and point of contention there is like, well, how do you recognize the cup as such, which is the traditional realist argument? Is like, okay, but you need an explanatory principle for how, when you lift up that cup, and I recognize it as such, and there's, because you have books behind you, there's other objects in the room, there's a whole field of intelligibility which we're both kind of in right now, and you made salient the cup, and we were discussing the cup as an example, but like, to recognize it as such, like, to, for you to have done that, for me, there has to be an essence or an essential eidos to the cup, which is a kind of pattern that when my mind reflects on it, I kind of lock into that pattern. You say cup, you use the logos, which means word cup. You say that to me, pings, and I recognize that in the field of experience or whatever. That's kind of something about how meaning's working or something. But like, the implicit in that is like the eidos, the idea of the cup as a pattern of intelligibility, and this as suchness, like, how do I recognize it as a cup, as distinct from a book? And yeah, no, I think there has to be a kind of invisible pattern or logos, um, beyond the particularities of your cup, with that specific design on it and the specific particular example you use, because that isn't cup, that is a particular cup, that is
Right.
instantiating the eidos of cup.
Mm. So
Well,
that
so
last phrase that you've just said, though, that is a particular cup that's instantiating the eidos of cup, right? That would be um, the metaphysical theory of Platonism, right? But all of the sort of data points that in experience that were pointed to before then, I think, would be things that the nominalist would actually agree to, and then it's just that last point about the theory that accounts for it that they would disagree with. So they would say, you know, they'd like agree, like, yeah, there's a cup here, like I use the term cup, all those things. They'd just have a different story when it comes to the theory. So rather than saying, like, there really is a cup there that I grasp with my intellect, it would be, well, there's a community of people existing before me who use these tools. I kind of learn to, attach this noise. I form some purely psychological idea, perhaps, about what a cup is. Actually, like even my token idea of cup might differ from your idea of cup. Like we might be in different mental states, right, when we're thinking about cup, but we're still able to communicate, because the theory, it doesn't fall out of the theory that like we can't communicate, because that's what's being explained by it, but it sort of would explain maybe some disagreement between cultures. Like there might be like cultures where there's like a weird kind of leaf or something that's used a cup, and you might be like a Westerly, but well, hang on, that's not a cup, as so I think I think the nominalist does have a story to tell about sort of like how we acquire the word, like why we use it in the way we do, and that is where I think we sort of fall into that's where we fall back almost to the theory comparison thing between like the metaphysical theories, where it's like, well, what are the virtues of these? So in terms of like parsimony, in terms of like coherence with maybe our intuitions or our other commitments that we have in other areas, like these sorts of things are going to be the considerations that are taken into account in doing a theory assessment. But then that's where then I have like the problem of, well, those theoretical virtues are values which aren't like stance independent exactly. I mean, most people agree to a few of them, like the parsimony ones or whatever, but there's other like, like the one that I said about cohering with our intuitions or something. Like not everyone is going to agree that that's a good virtue necessarily to have or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would want to ask the naturalist, how did our ancestors name it cup? Like the first human who named it cup, what happened there? Because I think I still see I still see them with a kind of what's the word? There's like a kind of onus on them in the argument to give me an explanation for how cup becomes a word that's coined and useful and all of these things. Because I see that as the activity of the logos. I see that as a kind of pattern being distilled about something that helps me drink and something that contains water or something.
It's worth saying that for the naturalist, there still is that there is a pattern in reality, like that's an appropriate piece of language maybe to use to talk about it. But the point is that pattern in reality is like purely, I don't know, like contingent and conventional, that I attach that word to it. Like that pattern in reality isn't really a cup. Like maybe there's
good
this,
emphasis.
like, really
good
emphasis.
emphasis. Yeah. What were the words you used? Contingent.
Contingent and conventional. Like the language is conventional. Like it's not. I don't mean. Okay, so this is a tricky distinction as well. I don't mean like the noise that we use, like at any, like there could be a linguistic community that uses cup and actually means elephant. I mean like the thought that is had or the proposition that's expressed as something as being cup. The nominalist is just going to say, well, whatever that I mean, this is where it's difficult again, because even the idea of what a proposition is and stuff is this sort of stance independent thing that can be maybe got at, that's truth at, because it is going to be something that a lot of people in that naturalist camp might not agree to. That sort of, I mean, some might, but a lot of the really sort of hardcore reductionists aren't going to agree to that being this like thing. They're just going to say, no, it's just psychological states that are subjective and individual to persons, and that's how they.
So then I know you're becoming an avatar for nominalism here. Sorry, I mean,
it's all right. Don't worry, it's all right.
But then my question would be like, okay, but why should we care about a cup? Like, why? What kind of? Why should we care? What meaning does it have? What kind of force? Like, okay, it's, what do you use? Contingent and conventional. It's a contingent and conventional term that we've used to describe an element of our experience or something, okay? But like, I guess like, why should that matter? Because what am I trying to express? Because I think there is a meaning when we coin a word where we're kind of noetically or intellectually grokking or intuiting a meaning, like a real, like a pattern, and you're saying the nominalist would agree with the idea of a pattern.
I think what you're getting at here is easier to it's easier to answer that from the nominalist position in terms of things like cups, because they clearly have like a pragmatic use for a community. But I think there are examples which might be more difficult to get at. I mean, there's a bunch of different arguments in this area. I mean, so what I'm getting at here, just to finish that first thought, is like, well, a cup has like a pragmatic use or whatever. So if a linguistic community sort of, whatever the word is, well, let's just say it's cup that the first person uses, they kind of baptize, this utensil that they're using for storing fluids as cup, and then that just kind of gets shared amongst a linguistic community of speakers and passed down and whatever. And that has a pragmatic use for the community. So as long as it has that use, it sort of stays in use. It sort of stays in usage by the community, I guess. But there are cases where about like true facts, and I maybe there might be some scientific facts, maybe mathematical facts about like mathematical theorems where it's difficult to connect what's going on there to any pragmatic utility. Some forms of art and stuff like that as well. Like so a lot of these things, I think, might be more difficult to provide a plausible nominalist account of why those why those areas of discourse like exist and how they would have been baptized in the first place.
Well, that's a really good point, because what was your BA in? I think I might have heard
software engineering.
Software engineering, yeah. Because I think this comes to the attention of like STEM and humanities as well, because I thought a fair amount about this, like, because the humanities proper are concerned with, I guess, a helpful schema for thinking about this would be a Kantian pure reason and practical reason, is how I've been thinking about it anyway. Like, for me, like the STEM fields are more concerned with practical reason, in the sense of like there's a kind of axiom that's given, and then
here's the framework. Yeah,
that's like given, right? And then it's like we reason practically to make a plane fly, create a website, whatever engineering problem we have to solve, we just put the axiom here, we don't question this, and we reason practically from there, okay? Whereas the humanities, poetry, philosophy, the proper concern of philosophy, I'd say, are things like pure reason, like what is this axiom? Like what is this value that is the predicate for science, for example? And it's concerned with values, right? And so,
well, there's a value assumption, and then there's a field that's concerned. Well, I guess I view philosophy as the field that's concerned with like questioning those values, right, that we're standing on to do any of this stuff in the first place. And I think there is a truth of the matter, and my view is that the truth of the matter is that there's like there's certain, it's intrinsically good, for example, to pursue these things. But this is where I find there's more tension between.
So I think that's a Platonic move, just quickly. That intrinsically good thing of like truth, like capital T, is like something that in itself you and I ought to aspire to, and thus we're going to study philosophy. That idea is like there's an inherent good in truth,
right?
And I think the naturalist or nominalist has to pump that up, because if we're going from a cup that has practical uses for staying alive, say, but why stay alive? The Greeks might say eudaimonia, or there's a hierarchical thing there with the cup. It's like the cup is the proximal good, but like why should that matter? And then you go up and up and up. So that it's that in itself move you did there. It's like a subtle thing. It's like truth in itself, goodness in itself, beauty in itself, which is the project of theology, philosophy, and I would say the humanities in general, is to offer a speculative and reflective account of and meditation upon these axiomatic values, which underlie science, definitely, but also is more broadly like the project of accounting for human value, and like I'm still struggling to see how the nominalist or naturalist truly accounts for good in itself. Like, why truth in itself? Because one quick thing on that is like the scientist is involved in a narrative, and it's because science was born out of philosophy. But like this pursuit of capital T truth is the mythic spiritual thing, like it's platonic flight of the soul from ignorance to truth, like the anagoge out of the cave. Like this whole move underlies a project like finding out what the structure of the atom is, or how gravitation works, or whatsoever it is. I think there's a care for truth, capital T, in itself. At least ideally, not everyone embodies this ideal, but at least ideally, that is the principle of the academy. And so, yeah. So
I guess while I'm on board in the sense that I have this belief that these things are intrinsically valuable, or like should be pursued. Where I think there's just an area of disagreement here. So there isn't like there isn't like this gotcha moment where it's like, so you are committed to these things being valuable in and of themselves, but your theory can't account for it. Often I just find it's like, yeah, that's why like it's pointless to study theology and to do philosophy in this way where it doesn't serve the sciences, and why like maybe the arts, in where unless it's like a movie that I care about that can that can bring me pleasure or something when I'm outside of my 9-to-5 capitalist job, because again, like all the beliefs sit together in this sort of framework. It just isn't valuable. Like it just isn't important to, even if there are true beliefs in that area, they just don't matter. And I find there's just a disagreement there. I mean,
what do you mean? Unpack that a little. I don't quite follow.
Yeah. So like for me, I'm going to say, well, if someone asks me, and I had this conversation recently, like why study philosophy of religion, for example, my position is I do think there are practical uses for it, whatever your stance is. But I also was like, well, I just think it's interesting to figure out what's true, like in and of itself, right?
Whereas, like Nathan, I just want to really emphasize this. That's so important in today's world, and even the narrative around university, and especially what you're doing, like philosophy of religion, philosophy. There is a whole wing of people in the narrative of saying like, how practical is that, right? Because it's literally, because this is what I'm saying about like the STEM value system, and the like STEM is nested inside the mother of, which is the humanities. Like, well, as we said earlier, like theology is the queen of the sciences. Like there's a real ancient scholastic and Greek philosophical tradition to what the academy is, right? And sorry, I just wanted to emphasize that, because that is so important in the cultural narrative. What's philosophy worth, practically speaking? What you're going to do with that? So what you're going to do with that move is like immediately reducing it to a practical end, a practical telos. How much more money are you going to make for that?
Yeah.
How much? Can you show me the material outcomes of like why? But you're wanting to say no, like no, I find this a good in itself. Okay, and I think that is. I might be just being sloppy with my philosophy here, but I think it's fair enough to say it. I think it's analogous to Kantian pure reason. When he's writing his first critique, he's wanting to get at what's behind practical reasoning. This is before the categorical imperative of his practical reasoning. He's saying like, what are the ideal transcendental conditions for rationality? What is pure reason? And what is the transcendental synthesis in the mind that's going on to underlie our capacity for reason? And that project is analogous to, I think, how can I say it? I think that's a really important and essential project, which is, properly speaking, the project of the humanities. And that I think for you to say to someone, oh, it's just good in itself, and feel very comfortable and confident in saying that, I think that's so important. And I think there is a slight danger in a kind of technocratic age, do I want to say, which looks through techne, through like Greek techne, through technology, through practical outcomes, and that hermeneutic is then applied to the humanities and disparages it entirely. Because what is it worth? Like, what is it worth to think about what love is, or think about what goodness is, in light of, I don't know, an engineering
quarterly
system
returns,
that can fly you. Quarterly returns. Yeah.
I'm in the same camp, but I do find that like from the point of view of like of disagreement with people who don't like share the position that I do, I sort of I can't like point to this gotcha, because they will just bite the bullet and sort of say, well, they're not going to view it as biting the bullet. It just is biting the bullet from like my theory, right? But they're going to just be like, well, yeah, it is pointless because it doesn't produce those practicalists. Like that just is what I kind of believe. Or if philosophy, like there's good philosophy, and what that good philosophy is in serving the sciences or whatever. But yeah, all this stuff about like whether God exists, or like moral philosophy, maybe. Like there was a recently really popular blog post, I think, by a philosopher about how sort of like doing meta ethics and moral philosophy is like this really like antiquated and pointless thing that should sort of drop out of philosophy, and it's holding us back in all these different ways. And I think that this does fall out of this like value disagreement, or almost like a metaphysical disagreement. Like it's not that is like it's not that that's the only way of viewing the world, right? It could be that is like part of the true system of reality, but there's also another plausible way, like where that's not the case. That could be the true way of viewing reality. And yeah, when it comes to the disagreement, I think all you can say to the person who thinks that these intrinsic goods don't exist or are pointless is, you can sort of say, okay, well, if you sort of catch yourself on from time to time in your experience of life finding some of these things valuable, just having curiosity in something for the sake of finding out more things, but you can't apply it in any way, then maybe there's an inconsistency there. But they could still be, that might not, you're just going from like your experience of reality. It might not be the case for them. They might genuinely just think it's utterly pointless.
Well, I think one of the things, how are you doing for time, by the way, Nathan? I know
I'm okay for time for a bit.
You're right for a bit.
Yeah.
I'll just give me a shout, okay, when you've got a.
Yeah, don't worry. It's I think I could do like another hour or so. I've got to go to like Lidl at some point because my parents have got COVID. I've got to do their shopping.
Of course.
But yeah, don't worry. Like it doesn't close until the evening or something. So yeah.
Cool. Wait, you just said something really good there.
So yeah, disagreement. If you catch yourself in your experience like finding something intrinsically good, for its own sake,
yeah. Okay, so I was going to say persons, right? So like, okay, because this is coming out of Plato's metaphysics of love, especially in the Symposium, where he gets it's really fascinating because like the Symposium is like a Greek drinking party where it's all males basically attending and basically pontificating on love, and like the female comes through in Socrates, who's like, Socrates is like, oh, I was taught in the ways of love by someone called Diotima, who's like a priestess, I think. And anyway, so Diotima is like the feminine figure in the Symposium, implicitly through Socrates. And she gives one of the most beautiful and influential ideas about love, in the whole of philosophy. And hers is the ladder of love, that we have proximal objects of our eros, let's say sexuality in the body, but then higher than sexuality in the body is moral character, intellect, the inwardness of a person, and then higher than that maybe is the ideals that the intellect is devoted to, justice, truth, beauty maybe, and then it goes higher and higher and higher, like that kind of thing. And it's kind of an anagoge in a sense of my desire, my eros, towards proximal objects, and then finding that that's not finally what I'm desiring, and that it's actually a window or a door into a higher form of eros. And so what I wanted to do is kind of make the conversation a bit about persons at that point, because the way we love another person is in the same way we love philosophy. So you used a very specific term, I can't remember how you put it, just the idea of something being a good in itself, okay? Like intrinsically? Okay, yeah, there you go, intrinsic value, right? So like we love persons, our love of persons is this way. Like it's to truly love a person is to love them as such, like to love as a form of intrinsic value. And what I'm basically saying is not, definitely not, in terms of practical reason, in terms of the material net benefit for me in this relationship or whatever it is, okay? And people have endeavored to apply that in a kind of secular and modern age, a kind of rationality to relationships, even the idea of like, cut off your friends if they're not giving you a net benefit of negativity or whatever.
If you're not
It's like,
living your best life or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
how absurd. Because that's not so, is it? Like, persons, like even like a newborn child, it's like there's some glory inherent in that we kind of are humbled before or something, and that's kind of what's happening with love, is this kind of recognition of inherent value. And so
Well, I think if I just pause what you're saying for a second, because I do think like what you're describing for me really does fall out of like this Christianized Platonist sort of way of viewing the world, right? And I agree that that's like a character of my
it falls
phenomenology
out
as
of
well.
it falls out of it. Okay.
But the thing is, like, so when, for example, like when I've been really depressed or like before I'd sort of come to incorporating certain Platonic or Christian ideas into my what's the Husserl phenomenology, like Leben, my life world, right? Before I'd incorporated these ideas into my kind of life world, I really would like go on a walk and I would see like trees in the sky and a grassy field and the sun shining down it. And rather than being like, this is beautiful, I would be like, oh, there's like my biological system tricking me into thinking that this is an advantageous place to hunt.
I've been there, Nathan. I've been there as well myself. Yeah, I know exactly the kind of spiritual state you're describing there.
So I wouldn't, even though I agree with you, like when it comes to persons and stuff, I agree there's this intrinsic, like, yeah, there's like a glory to a child being born or something. But again, I just have this problem of the different, like, well, I could adopt this different it's like Wittgenstein's duck rabbit thing, you know, like where you see it one way and it's a duck, you see it the other way and it's a rabbit. It's like I can do that with all of my experience almost, and sort of see you know, the baby being born as like, oh wait, and see the baby being born as like oh well, there's like humans furthering themselves you know, on the selfish gene figuring itself out, and yeah, you know, and I'm still just stuck back in that rut of like, well, I sort of prefer the other one.
Well, look. How about, that's fair.
Yeah.
Because I have a distinct memory of walking through Hyde Park in London, and when I was really depressed and really nihilistic, I would say. And what it is for me, how I'm relating to what you're saying there, is like it's a kind of relativity of like, okay, there's a great oak tree there, but it's kind of like the values are flattened. It's just like, who cares? Like that, why does that matter at all? So that's how I'm relating to what you're saying now. I mean, I've been there, and I think that's a kind of existential alienation. But I guess what I want to say to you is like,
I did cut you off.
That's okay.
What you were saying, yeah.
What I want to say to you is like, is that true? Like, is there a space where we can say that's a hermeneutic that you and I have both had in our lives, okay, in relationship to an oak tree, say, walking through a beautiful park, was just like, it's this peripheral relative thing that's just nature working, and it doesn't really matter all too much, versus, let's say, a more poetic attitude of like sitting in the park in the glory of the oak tree, drawing it, reverence for this sacred wholeness and unity of nature and the beauty of it. Like, those could be two different hermeneutics, we could say, or ways of interpreting an aspect of our experience that we both seem to be sensitive to. So what I want to say to you is like, is there a way of saying that one hermeneutic is a kind of ignorance or a kind of misperception, and that one is closer to the truth? I have my position on that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because I think that would be an important kind of line of conversation.
Well, I think that falls back to the theory ladenness thing about perception, right? And then it comes into, well, the criteria by which I would judge between them are like aesthetic values and stuff, and the aesthetic values are partly informed by the metaphysics as well. You know, there's no mind-independent stance to evaluate these things from. And then another related problem is there's no sort of language-independent stance to evaluate these things from. But well,
let me tell you this quickly then. For me, that experience, which hopefully is fair to your experience, but I was just trying to relate something that I felt like quite similar.
It is, I'd say, yeah.
Okay, good. Because for me, that was one of the most depressed. Like, I don't know if I was at suicide, but like I was close on that kind of precipice of meaning kind of thing. It was one of the darkest periods of my life, bleakest. And I can reflectively look at that and say, like, yeah, I mean, that's all connected to my, I would say, almost blindness to the glory of nature. Let's put it that way, or something like that. Or if you brought that same kind of sterile attitude to the birth of a new child, okay, and that child's, you know, your cousin or part of your family, you might rightly be filled with kind of regret that, you know, you missed that glory because of your own tempest of emotions, your own existential thing. But this is I'm drawing on my experience here, and I want to hear what your thoughts are on this. But I think there'd be a legitimate way to say, look, Sam, snap out of it. There's a new child, there's a new life here. This is participating deeply in your story, in your family. You're going to know this. All these arguments, and I mean, I think it's actually a miracle life and the way it works, or something close to miraculous, like the way well, won't go there, but that's how I would see something like the birth of a new child, and I think there's almost an can I say objective, something like an objective basis to say, Sam, if you're missing that glory, there's something less than ideal about that. You know, there is something less than ideal about that, and that is something to repent of, actually, which repent just means turn from. So like turn from this kind of blindness to the glory of the world, and open your eyes, really, because again, there's whole spiritual traditions which talk about the nous, our capacity for, we could say, something like intuition or imagination, and how this nous, this eye of the mind, this eye of the soul, can become blinded, and that we can only see with our fleshy eyes, and that kind of language, I think, is apt, at least when thinking about my experience of how I might have missed the glory and missed the meaning of life and only seen relativity, and actually been consumed by a storm of my own negativity, or I don't know if I want to say that, but like the storm of my own existential cloud feels like it was blinding me from a kind of light. So what do you think about all of that? Because I think for me, that's a kind of objective way of saying, looking back on my experience and saying, oh, look how blind I was, and how grateful I am that this is not how I encounter trees or persons now in my life. And so what are your thoughts on
that? I do share with you the thing that you said about there would be maybe a sense of regret afterwards, or, you know, a voice of conscience that would inform a different course of action. And, you know, I would also agree that I think, looking back on the situation, it would be like appropriate for someone to say, come on, sort of snap out of it, as it were. But I also think that there is a response to those there's a response to those sort of criticisms, or, you know, that voice of conscience, whatever, which could be listened to as well. And maybe this is where, I mean, this is what I think some religious themes are kind of expressing. So I was thinking, as you were talking, actually, I quickly Googled, because I always forget the quote, but in Paradise Lost, you know, Satan says the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And I think that, again, it comes, if you were to and it's like, what's the principled reason you could appeal to for distinguishing between these two voices? But if you were to listen to that latter voice, you could sort of say, well, you could equally say, well, actually, they're wrong for telling me to snap out of this, because, you know, they're just living this lie of the, you know, the illusion of the presentations of their phenomenology, which are informed by their own particular theories.
So my problem with that is my problem with that is that if you run that story to the end, I think, okay, so I think where we get somewhere in this conversation is something like Jordan Peterson's emphasis on evil And the idea of like putting a stake in the ground somewhere.
Yeah, it's almost something where you can't like it's like in these in these edge cases where the moral infringement of something is only minor. It's kind of like it's easier to sort of loosely reason about it. But when the moral infringement is like this truly evil thing, it's like no, like there's a point where you get off the wagon at some point. Or,
Well, look,
but
let
then
me put
some people
it
don't,
to you
yeah,
this
yeah.
way, Nathan. If you and I ritually and routinely, and not just you and I, but let's do something Kantian with it. Let's say if we universalize this principle for all people in all places, right? If we ignored the glory of a newborn, like really, like I'm really serious. Like if we did not appreciate the goodness, the wholeness, the beauty inherent in this person who's coming into the world. I don't know if you could say person yet, but whatever. This
Yeah,
child.
sure.
If we invert that principle, if that doesn't happen, you get the dissolution and unwinding and unraveling of our whole. Look, man, I mean, to go dark and extreme, you get something like what Ivan's talking about in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, where he's like talking about these really horrific cases of child abuse and child neglect and stuff like this as an argument against religion. And I think we end up somewhere like that. And I do think we need to kind of, I think that is a useful move that Peterson does in like trying to draw out hell or something. Like if we neglect, and it's the same with nature. If you say, if you want to make an argument against environmental denigration, for example, good luck doing that without a sense of the inherent value. I think that's the word you use, inherent value of an oak tree, let's say. The encounter with it as a spirit, as a life form, as like all of this depth. And that I think the Romantics, for example, when Britain was industrializing, were doing this. That was their poetic project, was that you had these industrial cities eating up Britain's forests and getting all the coal out and all these things. Blake called it the satanic mills, right? Like the satanic mills were churning, and they were really crying, like guys, like a reverential relation to nature is crucial here, guys. And if you get it into Tolkien, that's something like what's happening at Isengard and stuff like this, and then the Revenge of the Ents. But like bit of a meandering point, but it was just like to say that it leads to, like, I'm just basically saying it to you this way, it leads to hell if Nathan and Sam universalize that principle of when we were in a dark place before and didn't see any other meaning in the world, didn't appreciate any of the value or meaning in the world at all. It feels like we've both been there. And I'm saying, like, okay, we've both been there, fine. But what are we going to say now? Are we going to say now, should we universalize that nihilism? Should we like make that now an ideology and say, okay, guys, let's try and live by this? And maybe if we did a Kantian move on it and said, like, let's universalize the walking through nature blind and not noticing the anima, the spirit, the soul in this world around us, blind to that, meaningless. Okay, let's universalize that. And then to me, that's like, okay, well, that's like environmental degradation straight in there. Okay. And those ideas are really related. I've been talking to someone called Anne Baring. I've had a few conversations with her on YouTube, and she wants to really emphasize this loss of, for her, it's the feminine. For her, it's connected to something like the mother goddess or the feminine, but she really wants to emphasize this loss of the sense of the sacredness of nature. And I know this is maybe a slightly tangential theme, but I do see it how it's related, because it's like, for me, there's almost something ethical about getting our thoughts tuned to truth, or our sensibilities tuned to beauty, or our characters tuned to goodness. Something like those things, like because it is hell. Because I would argue that it is hell if you scale out and universalize the opposite of those things. Yeah, what are your thoughts? Because it's fascinating that we share that experience as a touch point. And I would say I don't want to go there ever again. I would not want my brother or my parents or anyone to experience that. Anyone I love or care about, I don't want them to experience that. And I don't want to universalize it. I don't want a philosophy to be made of that and an ideological program to be made of that nihilism. I don't want any of those things because I judge it as a fundamental ignorance of my soul to be blind to reality. Those are some of my thoughts anyway.
I definitely do sort of share this, that share aspects of that, at least, like almost where the pragmatic or the prudential considerations, whatever, just become so powerful that it like pushes me towards a kind of realism. But that I don't know that I can extend that beyond myself, because even though, even so, a lot of the people who I talk to, for example, who are very happily atheists and not sort of adopting realism about various entities or maybe aesthetic values and things like that in the world, they're sort of happy to sort of with their metaphysics to just say, well, yeah, but I just wouldn't act like that because it wouldn't like make me happy or whatever, it wouldn't. So like even though there's no like real wrongness maybe, or real telos of rational creatures away from behaving in that way towards some kind of final end of like a transcendental good or something, or a transcendent good, even though that's not the case, they're like, yeah, well, it just contingently happens to be the case that I don't want to, make.
Well, then I would just say that's an unreasonable position. Like technically, that is an unreasonable position, and they're entitled to it. But I mean that because they're not supplying me with a reason. That's what I mean. Like they're not giving me a reason for that. Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
I guess I don't. Are you saying
have reverence for the new child? Why? My Platonic realism is giving you a reason, Nathan, as to why I will be venerating the child, and that I think that it's a broader social good to do so. Okay, that's my reason in my position I'm giving to you. Okay, now what I hear you say there with the atheists, or maybe say, yeah, let's just say atheists, on this point, and you're saying, okay, they just accept that this is just how it is, and they don't really have a reason for it, and maybe that's wrong, and if so, please tell me. But that's what I heard you say, and at that point, I've just got to go, cool. I think my position is reasonable. I think yours is not reasonable, and we're at an impasse at that point. It's like, do we care about having a reasonable philosophical worldview or not? I've supplied my reason for why I think this is a good, and if you're just saying that's accidental or contingent, that just doesn't. That's fine. It just doesn't seem like a very reasonable argument to me. And then that gets into, I guess, whether we should care about reasons and such like. But that is subtly connected to nihilism, actually, because you get into this thing of like, oh, no meaning matters, no value matters. And then it doesn't really matter if your worldview is reasonable, because like, oh, logos, intelligibility, realism, like, no, none of that's real. So I don't need a reasonable worldview. And like, cool. But like, I mean, personally, I'm interested in having a reasonable worldview and reasons which justify and account for and give explanatory power to the values that I have. But do you think that's fair of me, or am I misunderstanding?
I think they would provide reasons for why they sort of have adopted that position. So like the reason would just be that it brings me more pleasure, say, to behave in this way, and more pain to behave in the other way. This kind of like hypothetical imperative or whatever, right? And maybe an analogy to sort of understand that thinking would be sort of like if you presumably you've got like a favorite food or something, right? But you would fall into like, it's not because you've grasped the ultimate food, right? It's like, but it's just this like contingent fact about you that is your favorite food. And maybe they'd say, well, that's the same for my morality system. But you know, the analogy is going to break down somewhere, but it would kind of be like, well, because you prefer that food, maybe you'd sort of recommend it to other people or whatever, and they're like, well, I do the same with my system of morality, and I'm not like irrational for being committed to the idea that other people should adopt this, because it really does bring more pleasure than pain or whatever. Or yeah, I think that.
So it's like you prefer bananas, I prefer apples. This just kind of is how it is. I really like apples, and I would recommend it to others and stuff. But
well, there's a couple of ways it could be. So it could be like, I mean, one view of the morality could just be that it's this purely like prescriptive thing, but it could get it could be grounded in a kind of empirical claim about the way that humans are, right? So where it's like, well, we've quite sort of group selected for things like altruism and stuff, which bring us pleasure, and so that therefore it's kind of like right for the majority of us to like ostracize people who don't act in this like way that treats other people with a way where they can like have pleasure and stuff like that, and that's what grounds the morality or whatever.
So I guess what I'm one of the thoughts that's coming to my mind as you're speaking is like, these people are able to give an explanation or an account for how something came to be the case, but I don't know that there is any sense of why, if you know what I'm saying. So I think like that's where I'm at here in this conversation, is like, I hear like, okay, so it's neurons, or it's contingency, or just tradition, or whatever the contingent reason is why I value this or that. That is the story of how we got here, how I got to this value system. And that's what they kind of say to me, is like, give me a story of how. But that's not kind of what I'm driving at with the why question. Is more of a different paradigm in a way. It's like saying, no, but why should you care about this newborn human being? Because you also care about ice cream, don't you? And you also care about, going shopping, or whatever the different values you have are. You care about those things, don't you, too? Yeah, okay, so like, is there a hierarchy of values, and why is it ritually important to welcome new humans to our community or something, or our family, or whatever? Why is that important? And they could say, well, okay, well, how that happened is evolutionary. There's an advantage to altruism, and human beings care about that, and therefore, and like, I could kind of even agree with that, because I do, like, I'm massively informed by evolution. I have massive respect for it, and like, I can just agree with that story, I guess. But like, why X instead of Y? Oh, that's confusing way to say it. Why this instead of that? The why versus the how, I think, is probably a tension I'm sensing here, because you could make arguments to justify different values on evolutionary theory, which I think would be reprehensible values. And so, aggression, scapegoating, tribal outing of certain people. I just did a video on scapegoating, and I'm about to dive into Girard's book on it. But, there's whole sociological literature around how we aggressively other certain categories of people to keep the unity and the coherence of the tribe and the social unit together. Anyway, we don't need to get sidelined on that, but I'm just saying I could make a plausible argument as to why aggression and scapegoating and killing others who aren't in my unit is a good, and I could tell that story of how that came to be through evolution. I'm just kind of saying, like, why peace over war, like why love over hate, like stuff like this. And that why is, again, this is related to our thing about STEM and humanities, I think, because that why is properly speaking the concern of the humanities, whereas the sciences methodologically that's not why they exist. They exist to show how something is the case, or to give a story of how an atom exists, and how I might fly from London to New York faster, or how the aeroplane might do that. I think that's a fair thing for me to say. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is actually one of the sort of key arguments for Platonism, right? It is like the forms can act as a kind of explanation for something. So I think when Socrates is in jail in the Phaedo, like it's like, well, why aren't you running away or something? And it's like, well, you can say, well, because my bones and my skeleton are in the prison. And it's like, well, that's not like an explanation of what, because the explanation should be inconsistent with the counter states of affairs. Because even if he was trying to run away, it could still be true that his bones and his skeleton are in prison. I think, or like if you're taller than someone, right? It's saying, well, you're taller by a head or something. Well, you could also be shorter by a head, so the head it can't be invoked as like this explanation of it has to be the form of tallness. I mean, that's a to sort of paraphrase. And I agree in these cases of morality that there has to be a distinction drawn between the causal story of how and like the explanation of grounding, I suppose, for like well, if you ask the question, in virtue of what is that good, right? What is it that answers that? And so for Platonists, it would be, well, like participation in the goodness, and then in the metaphysics, you've got to cash out, well, what does participation mean? What kind of existence is for? But for someone who's not adopting kind of Platonism, someone who's going to be a naturalist, they could, I think, ground it in pain and pleasure, and there might just be these things that would fall out of it, right? Which would be, well, in some contingent state of affairs, right, it could actually be the case that it was good to torture someone if it brought everyone the most pleasure or something. And I don't really share that intuition that would be right. But if you actually are committed to the theory, I think that just would be the case. It would kind of be like it would just be this sort of weird borderline case, sort of like, well, it's good for a soldier to sort of like jump on a grenade and they die and sort of save their other mates or whatever, and you're like, well, that's good, but it wouldn't just be good to like jump on a grenade and blow yourself up in the middle of nowhere or something, right? It's like, it's just this sort of weird edge case that happens to be the case. And I think someone who's committed to this kind of like idea that, well, the grounding is like pain and pleasure, would have these sort of edge cases that seem counterintuitive, but they could just say, well, yeah, that would actually be good, because that's just what goodness is. Like, what explains, in virtue of what is a situation good? Well, in virtue of in virtue of the pain and pleasure caused. I do think that these are legitimate counterexamples, right? That's why I don't hold to that theory. But someone who wants to hold to that theory, I mean, if they accept that, I'm going to have a hard time. Like, I don't know what else I can appeal to. I'm just like, but it is wrong. Like, it's like.
Well, I mean, yeah, I feel like that vision reduces us to animals in some way, like traditionally speaking, because the animal, what we share with animals is our sensation and our embodiedness and the pleasure and pain associated with that. So I think there's a kind of reduction to the animal there, and a denial of the noetic or the intellectual, and like the idea that it's this same subtle thing you've been saying the whole time of like we've been calling it inherent value, or truth as such, this kind of thing. I think like that's a noetic intellectual well, traditionally I think this is what Aristotle argued, like that's where we are on the ontological hierarchy of being, to be able to be intellectual basically, and also recognize real patterns in the world, understand something like gravitation. Like a sheep is not understanding gravitation, and yet for some reason we can grok that. But it's also like there's also a kind of like if that's true, then it kind of it puts our sensation into context. Like there's a way for living that is beyond the mere pull of our passions, the pull of our desire for pleasure and our aversion for pain. And there's something like, ethics, duty, like commitment to acting a certain way because this is true, because this is good, because this is beautiful. And that is a reason for transcending our animality. And this whole reason for transcending our animality goes for Plato with his vision of the soul as like the passion, the lower passions and the intellect, but also like straight into, you know, Christian morality, but also like Stoic, Roman, Greek morality, this idea of virtue. Because the whole scheme of virtue is in relationship to like the transcendence of pleasures and pain, or like, you know, especially like the classical Christian scheme, like patience. And there's I've looked a lot at this. I think it's really fascinating. But like they have like these polarities of like what sin is and what virtue is relative to it. So like you have the sin of sloth, and then you have the virtue of diligence, which just means work. And like there's like an inclination towards sloth because it's pleasurable, and there's a anathema towards diligence because it's painful. And then, but then it's the same with like, there's all sorts of really great ones. So like wrath. So there's like the sin of wrath, and then it's countered by the virtue of, I think it's patience actually, which means to suffer, to like bear your suffering on. And so again, you've got to admit, it would feel better for me to just be angry and like express that anger. But actually, if I embrace the pain, which is what patience means, it's similar to like a patient in a hospital, like they're undergoing a path, like a passion, you know, like to embrace that suffering, to be patient. That is actually what tempers our anger, and that actually tempers like cycles of retaliation. And that's why I think that the narrative of Christ is so profound, actually. But you know, and so the classical scheme of the Christian virtues is basically about the inversion of the pain pleasure thing, because like sin is associated with pleasure. That's what Dante's getting at with his like notion of, I think, or maybe it's Augustine or both, the idea of like disordered loves. So like, I love my sloth. I am in love with my sloth. Like sloth is my pleasure, and that's an animality to my sloth. And to overcome that, I need something like diligence, which is actually the inversion of that. And that's actually the image of God to like preserve certain values that are beyond mere pain and pleasure. But I mean, sorry, that's just a bit of a riff. I don't know if that's really an argument against what they're saying. It's just like,
yeah,
it's like an interesting thing to consider.
Yeah, like I'm not completely against any of the things you said. You know, I'm on board with like a bunch of them. But for someone who like is willing to bite those bullets, it's like, yeah, there almost is a point where you just reach an impasse in that conversation on some of these topics, where it's like, well, intuitions just diverge, and like you know, there's no more. It's not gonna. I can't just keep like pointing to the thing and saying, but I say it is good, and they're like, no, it's wrong or whatever. And you're like, no, but it's good, you know, and you just kind of like, it's just an impasse. Differed.
Sure. Well, I think that comes into back to the body and back to the Nietzsche thing I was saying at the beginning of like, try and live in sloth. And people do, and that actually can, because that's a narrative, like living in sloth and not cultivating your potential, say, and basically denying, I think of it as denying the spiritual gifts it is seeded in our heart. To be slothful is to completely deny that. It's to deny, not to cultivate ourselves, not to do anything, right? Okay. And so, but you can make a rational argument for sloth, okay? Like, I think it's lions, like sloth around the whole time. They do the hunt, they have the food, and then basically just chill. But like, you know, we have the same impulse as human beings. Like, we don't want to expend energy when we don't need to. Like, why on earth would you do that? And so, like, my point is that the narrative of pain and pleasure, or what I see as pure animality, try and live that out. And what I think traditional voices on this, like the Greeks, the Romans, like the Stoics, and also like Christian morality, these things basically say, look, that leads nowhere, or actually it leads to hell, a kind of hell, which is kind of Dante's whole point with his Inferno. Like, that leads to a kind of hell, and you should turn 180 degrees in that from that direction to the opposite direction towards something called virtue, and you should strive to embody that. You know, and I think that's, now we're talking about something like narrative, something about the way in which we can participate in a worldview. like how viable is, because this impasse, for me, the way I see something like that is like this atheist friend you're mentioning, or whoever we're using an example, as like, try and live sloth, try and live on the program of mere pleasure, pain, animal morality.
Well, I think the problem with that would be that so they'd probably say, well, sloth is actually something that's going to make me unhappy, right? It's going to cause me pain. But so the actual counterexample is this weird edge case of like, I don't know.
Sorry,
quickly,
let's unpack that. At what level unhappy? Because if I'm slothful, because I think what you're saying there is long term it might make me unhappy, but short term it could very easily be, or there's lots of different values like this, but like it's like the marshmallow experiment in psychology. Because I just wanted to make that distinction, because it could make me happy to be in a happy short term to be slothful, but long term. And so then at what level are you making that judgment?
Well, I think it would vary, right? So there's different ways that someone could say that there's something going on there, right? Someone could be like a rule utilitarian or something, right? And say, well, I should just act in terms of like how they cash it out normatively. They'd be like, well, I should just act according to the rule, which in general is going to like increase pleasure the most or minimize pain the most. And that might be one plausible response. Or they could say like, well, like there's like different qualities of pleasure or something, and you know, this like quality that even though like eating pizza and leaving the washing is gonna give me like a kind of pleasure, the quality of the higher pleasure or something would be like preferred or something like that. And I know there's like more responses that could be, but I think the real counterexamples would be like the ones that sit at those weird boundaries where it's like, you know, there's 5 people in a house or something, and one of them is being tortured for fun by the other 4, and the other 4, you know, I don't know, they get like their sustenance from it somehow. They get like it's the only like play that they get or something. So because there's nothing else to do in the house, like all these other things. So it does, if you do the kind of calculation, it brings them more pleasure. And then you want to, it's like, well, are we going to sort of set this experiment up, and you know, utilitarians can go and do it and see if they're like not like, well, this is wrong, well, they're doing it or something, you know. And it's a really, because the counterexamples, I don't think the counterexamples are like easy ones. I think they're sort of these weird scenarios that are quite kind of and I think they are real counterexamples, but they're just like sort of bizarre ones that you couldn't really set up or test.
Okay, so I mean, I think I might disagree with this, or at least there's something to tease out, because the pleasure of me eating a pizza is different from the pleasure of like having my room cleaned or something, or my room in order, or I don't know if that's the best example, but like, how can I say it? I guess there's a weight being carried what we mean by pleasure, because I think we could distinguish like sensory pleasure from a kind of noetic or spiritual pleasure. And if we're doing that, like qualitatively different pleasure, then I think we're invoking a hierarchy which the naturalist needs to account for. Because it seems to me anyway, the thing of like having my affairs in order, or like cleaning my room in a Jordan Peterson way, having things in order, is a kind of noetic order has overcome chaos, like all things are set in order kind of pleasure. Which is different from like the gratification of, you know, my appetites through pizza. And when you say pleasure and pain and pleasure, traditionally I think of sensory pleasure like eating a pizza, and I think that's the most immediate example and like the most obvious one, or sexual pleasure or eating food. Like this is what I understand by pleasure. And if you're arguing, or these people would argue, that actually, you know, like by being diligent or by being patient or by being humble or charitable, these Christian virtues, by doing these things, I am actually attaining to a higher form of pleasure. I think I am justified in then asking, okay, but what do you mean by pleasure now? Your conception of pleasure seems to be at least broader than my understanding of it traditionally, because it's like, for me, it's like pleasure eating pizza or having sex as these examples of like carnal pleasure. And Yeah, so I guess that's one of the things implicit in this kind of argument. And then and then there's of course the question which is related, which we've already been discussing, is like, why does it occasion pleasure to deny your appetite? Like, that's an interesting question, because especially if you take the biological narrative seriously, I am a being meant to survive and reproduce. There should be no higher pleasure than eating and having sex on that view, because it's a survival and replication program. Like, I am getting my calories and I'm replicating biologically by engaging in those two things. Why on earth should they be transcended? Why should there be a higher pleasure occasioned through the temperance of those passionate desires? So that's a related question, which we've kind of been discussing the whole time, of like, why is that so? Instead of like, again, there's a why, how thing lurking. Yeah, and then also, like, what do we mean then? What kind of pleasure are we talking about now? Or at least we're having an expansive conception of pleasure, aren't we, when we say that there's something that's giving me pleasure beyond my carnal pleasure? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, like I don't hold the position that like good is grounded in pleasure. So there's going to be a point obviously where I do like fall apart from this.
I know you've been adopting the devil's advocate really beautifully here. I think we've been discussing these ideas in a really interesting way, and so I'm not assuming that you're committed to these positions, but I think you've been really brilliant in trying to give a fair account for these positions. Sorry, go on.
But like so one of the things John Stuart Mill says, which I don't find particularly plausible myself, but he says so anyone who has experienced the two states, and he means like qualitative states, so of like I don't know, finishing a piece of art versus like watching a football game or something, or eating pizza or whatever, and anyone who's experienced the two will agree that the one that one of which is like of a higher quality than the other one or something. And I think that's an empirical claim, and it's not really established, in the essay, and it's just this one kind of sentence. But someone could maintain that, I guess, and sort of say, yeah, anyone who's experienced the two is going to say that this is like a higher quality or something. And then on the second point about evolution,
that's a reasonable argument, isn't it? Or do you take issue with that argument?
Well, I just don't know that it's empirically like born, because it's a claim about the way the world is, right? And I don't know that if you actually interviewed everyone, like every mathematician, say, who can do these like higher order proofs or something, which should be like a higher quality of pleasure to eating pizza. If you just interviewed them all, I have no idea like what percentage of them would say, I prefer the pizza to finishing like the proof. I don't know, like maybe
that's fair. That's fair. I mean, there is some empirical evidence with the psychedelic stuff that I think is at least interesting, that when mystical type experiences, this is Johns Hopkins, when mystical type experiences are occasioned through psychedelics, people subjectively regard them as some of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. So something like that is interesting, because I think there is an objectivity to human experience, and that disciplines like the social sciences in particular, sociology, maybe psychology, will take seriously surveys and things like that. And so I think fair enough, but I think it's plausible. It's at least a question that could be empirically looked into, couldn't it? Like the idea of like
exactly
a baby versus ice cream, or as what.
But it's got weak justification, I'd say, until we have really got some more like data backing it up, right? Because it's just like this random sort of. It's just well,
I think we've got sociological. That's fair. But I think there is sociological data around human values. Okay, but maybe that's another discussion. I don't want to get too tangential, but yeah, okay.
And on the second point about like the evolutionary stuff, I think, so, I mean, the kind of pleasure that's gotten from those things that are most conducive to survival, like reproduction or eating or whatever, I think it would obviously have to be good, and it would have to be pleasureful and not painful. But I don't think it would have to be the case that those things were much more pleasurable than everything else. Because I think like a model like Maslow's hierarchy of needs would sort of show, well, once those like lower order pleasures are taken care of, then there are maybe other pleasures that sit on top of those that might be they might be greater to like have, but it's just what the model is like the desire to actualize those things kind of drops out if the base level isn't taken care of. So like if you don't have food or something, for example, then you're not going to like care that much about, you know, self-actualization or something, whatever's at the top of the pyramid. And it's kind of like, well, self-actualization would be a greater pleasure, but if you've not got food, you like your attention's just directed away from that thing toward like the other lower pleasure, because you've got to like satiate that thing to like build up the pyramid or whatever. And maybe that would, you know, address sort of like the
why is it a greater pleasure is the how why thing comes back again. Why is self-actual? Why would the realization of my potential? Well, no, for the naturalist that's a problem though, isn't it, in their argument? Because the hierarchy, you're evoking the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Hierarchy, what that means is like that there's some things that are like of a higher rank in terms of their ability to afford pleasure than others. And so like, okay, cool, but like why should we actualize our potential? Why do we have spiritual needs, or why do we need meaning, such things as this? More subtle questions of the human spirit. Like why, I guess, would be part of the question for the naturalist, don't you? Because especially if you take the view of like an evolutionary naturalist, or like someone who's like committed to like the biological narrative solely, like my understanding of it is like it is a survival and reproduction program. So like aesthetic qualities like doing a painting or writing poetry or actualizing my potential, whatever that means, you know, cultivating my possibilities, which is what he's talking about self-actualization. Or implicit in it something like the notion of authenticity. That's an existential idea, but also it's kind of there in Jung, like becoming myself, individuating. These psychological models of human development. I don't know. For me, I see at the apotheosis of those schemes a kind of spiritual ideal. For Jung, it's individuation. For Kierkegaard, it might be authenticity. For Maslow, it's self-actualization. And so then the argument would be, okay, that's a higher form of pleasure than just eating a pizza or having sex. Okay, yeah, but like why? And that is what I'm still finding the problem with the naturalist position, is like just giving a reason for why that should be a greater pleasure than, because it's not obvious at all. And actually it's
well, that's a different question opposite of why it should be. That's something important to say, I think, because you said, because there's the question of like why in terms of explanation, right? But then there was like a moral question, the second one, when you said, well, why should it be like a higher thing? And the person could just say, well, you can't like appeal to another set of values to explain like why our values should be the way they are. Like they do. It's sort of like saying, you know, like for Platonism, when it's like, well, the form of the good is what makes things good, right? And if you said, well, like why should it be that way or something, it's sort of like just an infelicitous question or something, you know, like, because, well, that just is what it means for something to be good, is that it participates in, you know, in goodness, right? So if you're like, well, why should it be good? Why should it be that way? It's like, well, that's just a description of how reality works or something. You know, like it could be it'd be like a contingent state of affairs, maybe like in a counterfactual different world, right, where there was a different evolutionary history. It could be the case that, you know, the pleasures were ordered differently, but in our world it just is the case that that's how it is, I think, for the person on that view, again, because this isn't, you know, this isn't what I think is right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. I mean, let's start thinking of wrapping up, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Let's the next 10 minutes or so, and yeah.
Cool. Oh man, that was really cool. I
enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to learn more about what your position is, because it feels like you're taking up a bit of a mantle there. But that was really cool. I thought that we like exploring some of the nuances of the different worldviews in quite an interesting way. Yeah, nice. And so where are you at with like your YouTube and stuff like that? What are you've got this taught program with the masters, so you're going to just learn as much as you can in this next year and expose yourself to those different ideas. And are you just trying to have different conversations with people across the spectrum of worldviews? Because it feels like you're genuinely trying to figure out like what worldview is viable, and then where are you at with all of that stuff, I guess?
I guess what I'm trying to do is like, well, partly communicate philosophy to the public is like one of the goals through the channel. So I want to try and make sure that there's like a good standard of discourse, that there's like, you know, relevant experts in certain areas, or wherever I've got my like biases and things, that I'm also giving people who disagree with me like the appropriate space to like voice those disagreements and things as well. Like those things are concerns of mine on the channel. So yeah, the goal there is just to sort of continue trying to interview people about books and things that they've written, or articles or positions that they hold. I have like some open conversations and stuff which are more sort of informal, where people just kind of come in with various different positions and chat. And I do some like counter apologetic stuff as well when it comes to I'm not a big fan of popular level apologetics, sort of like, you know, like the sort you might see someone like William Lane Craig kind of engage in. And I think it's harmful for Christianity in a way, but I also think it can foster a lot of the in-group out-group tribalism and stuff like that. So I do some stuff pushing back against that kind of thing. But though recently I have sort of come to think I've got to be careful of my biases, right? Because if I spend too much of my time addressing the apologetics, I'm gonna establish this this skewed view of reality, where I've got all these reasons against the positions that they adopt, but the people who are more reasonable and you know, would have something to sort of say to me, and the kind of things that I'm thinking that might push me towards like Christianity into the positions that I adopt. Like I need to take those things seriously without having these stereotypes about apologists and stuff like that. So the channel's an aspect.
It's a problem with
thing.
YouTube, isn't it? Like that I've experienced, and I remember. I think you mentioned this to Paul van der Klee actually, but like the whole problem of like garnering attention for a very specific and particular domain, and then like the idea of like the desire to maintain that kind of area of interest or whatever. And like for me with my channel, like it is a subtle thing, because like fundamentally I should ideally be intellectually free to go wherever I want to with the channel. That's my thoughts anyway. And like there is this kind of feedback loop of like, you know, I looked at like I got really interested in Jung and like looked at alchemy and like did a few videos on that, and they've become quite popular. But like it's like, what am I gonna like? Is this channel now like a temple to alchemy? Yeah. And it's a real problem, because like how you define success on YouTube is views and subscribers, isn't it? Like, isn't that good? Like, and shouldn't I make more alchemy videos? But it's like, no, like you got to keep checking in to be like, well, why am I doing this? And am I being fair and holistic here? And am I in alignment with my own interests, really?
And I agree with that. And I think there's even some like psychological literature on, you know, if people write essays against positions that they hold, over time they're more likely to become like more sympathetic to the other point of view and stuff. So if you like this was done in terms of like political circles, and it is a consideration that I've got when if I say something that's like a really good criticism of American evangelical Christianity, and then people who are against that like come over to the channel like, yeah, that's right, like these people are all idiots or whatever. And then I've got that in the back of my mind when I'm like thinking of criticizing something that like Humanists UK have done or something. It's like, oh, what are these people gonna? And like recently I was like, well, I should do some videos like pushing back against some of these things I disagree with as well. And I do then get, you know, these comments about like, well, you're straw manning them, da, 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 da. And I genuinely don't think that I am, but I get from some of the vitriol and some of the comments that it's not just about like this intellectual disagreement. It's like, no, you're not allowed the freedom to disagree with these positions anymore. Like, you've got to be a mouthpiece for this particular position. Something YouTube's very sort of weird. Like, having a YouTube channel is very sort of weird like that, because there's all this weird human psychology of almost like you're building a tribe or a kingdom or something like that, and people who are going to subscribe are going to identify with it. And if someone criticizes you, they're going to like fight your corner. And it's like, is this actually conducive to like forming true beliefs? I'd rather I like having an audience that is, rather than like just call me an idiot or something, where if I've got something wrong, they'd be like, oh, I don't think you were fair here, but this was a good crit, and then it can help me, and that like I can modify my views over time. But that might mean getting slightly less views and being slightly less appealing, than just like the very reactionary why all people who disagree with me are morons with like clickbaity title, whatever, destroyed, debunked.
I love it, man. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Just it's cool to discuss that with you, because I've had my channel for a few years, and it's yeah, no, I think that's just an interesting and subtle one to try and keep on our own. I think it's a question of freedom. I think it's kind of a question of intellectual freedom, and like we shouldn't kind of feel guilty about exploring the opposite things of what we've said, because that is kind of how free thought happens, actually. Like, but yeah, and this kind of wedding to a particular position or a particular image of, I'm that kind of guy advancing these kind of arguments, and that's what people want. But instead to try and, because I feel like myself, I'm just on a kind of journey, and it seems like you're on a similar one of intellectual exploration, of reading, talking, thinking, reflecting, and that's going to be an ongoing thing. And even when I look at my videos from a few years ago, I'm like, I don't even really recognize that person. Like, I would criticize that person for saying these things, and there's a broader thing going on in what you're saying there. Just looking at myself, like, even a few years ago, it's like having that. It's like, I don't necessarily, if someone watched a video I did on alchemy, that's like a very particular thing. Hopefully they learn something insightful from it. But then, I just want to resist the image of like, because I did a video on alchemy, I therefore believe all of these mystical things about alchemy. It's like, I don't want to go that far. Anyway, Nathan, thanks for your time. Thanks for taking the time out. Like, I just thought this was really cool. Thought we like.
Yeah, I've enjoyed the conversation too. Like, thanks for reaching out and inviting me on, and like asking good questions and having a civil conversation as well. It's good to sort of like be able to explore ideas, but not feel like it's a battle or anything like that. Like I think that having those intellectual virtues around like being able to disagree and explore different areas is like really important in trying to figure out what's true. Right?
Yeah, I share that feeling as well. And do when you come to like thesis stage and stuff, please send me through stuff. I'd love to have a read and stuff, but that'll be like later next year, won't it? Yeah, cool. I'd love to have another conversation at some point as well. But
yeah, happy to do it at some point. Like, I'm a bit busy at the moment because I've got a few essays and things coming up, and I'm trying to figure out like moving back to Glasgow and trying to PhD applications and stuff. I'm trying to figure out, well, what do I do next with my life, right? And but yeah, when I've got the time on a weekend or something, feel free, we can sit down and chat if you're free as well.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks again, Nathan. Have a good day, and then catch up soon.
Awesome. Yeah, well, see you in a bit. Bye.
Cheers, mate.